I'm going to share my screen because I've got a lovely presentation that I've made for all of you folks today. Can you see my Legend Chasers screen, people? All good. Lovely. Okie dokie. I'm just going to move that over there. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today for your latest instalment of Legend Chasers. So this month, your wonderful team have asked me to cover a wee legend from over the pond in Scotland, over with me, the absolutely iconic Loch Ness Monster. So before we get started, just a tiny bit about me. I'm Erin. I am the host of the Myth Monsters podcast. I'm originally from Essex in southeast England, which is about 30 minutes out of London. So I'm very, very south and very, very central. I have been a mythology nerd since I was really, really small, with my parents reading me Greek myths rather than traditional fairy tales growing up. And my absolute favourite is the Iliad. My favourite myth, though, altogether is Orpheus and Eurydice, which I think is the most tragic, beautiful love story of all time and shows truly the commitment that two people can have to each other in going into the underworld for one another. I am also working on a PhD in myth studies at the University of Essex at the moment. My thesis focuses on female monsters, feminine monstrosity, and how this was reflected in ancient cultures through monsters that are still used to describe women to this day. And a fun fact is that my favourite monsters are Kelpies, which are a Scottish monster as well. And we'll talk about them a little bit later as well, because they kind of relate to Nessie. But for cryptids, I really love Mothman because he's a bit ridiculous. He's a West Virginian monster from your guys' side. And he is exactly what he says on the tin, and I appreciate that with him. Well, I think probably the best thing to do is why am I here with you? Well, that's because I do host Myth Monsters podcast, and I have been for the last 2 years. I started the podcast as a creative outlet in 2021 during the COVID lockdowns here in the UK, but it focuses mostly on the actual monsters, cryptids, and folklore creatures rather than the heroic stories and those full myths, which is what I personally wanted to find in a podcast. I also really try to cover monsters from around the world and from different cultures instead of focusing specifically on ones that are more popular westernized monsters that we're all super familiar with. I've also been very, very lucky, and Myth Monsters is the #1 rated mythology podcast on Good Pods, which is a podcast hosting service, since February this year. And I've had over 65,000 listens or downloads from over 116 countries worldwide, making me, hopefully, a bit of an expert in the field. I'd love to hope. But I'm here to talk to you today about a monster that's much closer to my home, and that is the Loch Ness Monster. So please enjoy this little picture of one having some gas, because I thought it was very, very cute. So what is the Loch Ness Monster? Now, the easiest answer to this is that she is a sea monster. It's the nice generic answer that we can give. And of course, I'm going to go more into that today. But it really begs the question of what really is a sea monster? I've talked about cryptids and I've talked about mythical beasts, but what is Nessie and what is the difference between a myth monster and a cryptid, I hear you ask? So, an easy way to think about mythical monsters is that they are proven to have been created and are fictional. So, mostly coming from an ancient belief system or even derived from misidentification or cautionary tales. So some really good examples of this are unicorns, gorgons, dragons, and the Minotaur, where we do know that they did not most likely exist. Although the slight exception we have to this rule are dragons, because of course we have Komodo dragons, but they were named after the mythical beast, as well as my primary school maths teacher. Mythical monsters usually come from an ancient civilization, meaning that the country or culture that they come from is usually no longer around or has considerably aged out of the belief system. So much like those ancient mythologies like Greek, Roman, and Celtic mythologies. It leaves an interesting question, though, on yourselves in the US. What would we consider US mythology? Well, because the US is such a new country in terms of ways of the world, we would actually consider US mythology to be more of your native mythology. However, anything outside of this sits within cryptozoology. So, cryptozoology, in comparison, is realistically the modern version of mythology and is considered a pseudoscience. So, it's a little bit lenient in terms of belief. A cryptid is a creature that hasn't been proven or unproven to exist. So, it leaves the book completely open to interpretations, for sightings, but also ends up being open to skeptics and illegitimacy and hoaxes. A great example of this is, of course, Bigfoot. That's probably the most famous one. You've also got Mothman and the Yeti, but most importantly for this session, the Loch Ness Monster is included in one of these. So, going back to Nessie, what is she exactly? And what does she look like? She is described as many things, but the most popular of that is a dinosaur-looking creature with a long neck, either flippers or stubby little paws, humps on its back with a horse-like or dinosaur-like head. It's not ever said 100% how big Nessie is, but it's believed that she is between 15 to 30 foot, which is pretty big. It's around the same size as a large great white shark. And if you're pushing it to the 30 foot, I mean, it's bigger than most sharks you can imagine. She has been noted to sometimes have sharp teeth, but sometimes she's noted to have none at all and is completely toothless. And she has also been contested as to whether she can actually walk on land or not and just lives beneath the sea, as she has been spotted both on land and on the sea. She does live completely underneath the sea as a standard, and she does breathe air. So she comes up for air just generally to breathe, very much like any kind of sea-based mammal. Now, you'll probably already know, and I've said it a million times out of just habit, that she is affectionately nicknamed Nessie. This, of course, is due to the loch that she is found in, but in the traditional Gaelic, the original language of Scotland, her name was Nesseg, which is slightly pronounced the same way. I will say it is slightly a lost language, so my pronunciation is off the cuff a little bit. But she was nicknamed this back in the 1940s, and classically before this, she was unoriginally named Monsterfish, or sea serpent unofficially. But she's generally known to be an extremely elusive monster. And if you do manage to bump into her, she is usually very non-aggressive and will just try and get away as quickly as humanly possible beneath the waves. Now, there is no 100% guaranteed way of knowing, but we do believe that Nessie would be surviving on a diet of mostly seaweed, fish, and eels, but maybe the occasional mountain goat that would fall into the loch. We do also believe that there is only one Loch Ness monster, and we assume, and as we should, that she is female. And we think that she has an extremely long lifespan and that she's been alone, unfortunately, all this time. Now, I just want to take a second to talk about Loch Ness itself. Loch Ness is in Inverness in Scotland, which is up near the northern coast. If you've ever been to Scotland or even northern England, you will know that it is immensely cold over this side. And the average temperature around Loch Ness is about 59 Fahrenheit in the summer. And I did have to look up the conversions, I have to say, and around 36 Fahrenheit in the winter. This also makes the water immensely cold, and it averages out at about 42 Fahrenheit all year. So it's not really recommended for swimming unless you are very brave and ready for some water shock. Now, the actual water itself is 126 fathoms deep, which makes it the largest body of water in the UK, and the second largest loch in Scotland at 22 square miles across, the first of which, then the biggest, is Loch Lomond, which is just a little bit further down the west coast. It also makes it deep enough to have every single person in the world stand in the loch 3 times over. That is how deep we're talking. And of course, loch is the Gaelic term for lake, and you'd be clobbered by the nearest Scots person for calling it Lake Ness, I do promise you. It does also have a man-made island in the middle called Cherry Island. A few people do live on this, although a very, very small community. And at the moment, actually, and this is a really fun fact, there is actually a nudist colony living on the island at the moment. There is, Rochelle, I see you reacting. I'm very thankful that I haven't accidentally spotted anyone yet. There is a gorgeous castle on the coast of Loch Ness as well called Urquhart Castle. And this is that right-hand picture on the screen. It's a proper traditional Scottish castle, beautifully made, and it sits gorgeously over the loch. But in regards to the actual loch itself, again, it's really murky and dark water, but really, really poor visibility, and generally the habitat of numerous fish species, eels, leeches, lampreys, and sometimes even otters and seals. Now, I did mention mountain goats earlier, and I mentioned it in passing, but I've got to talk about them. So you see these beautiful pictures that I've got here. You can see the mountainous kind of cliff sides that you've got around Loch Ness. Well, that means we have mountain goats. They're very tiny little pygmy goats, and they're very, very sweet as they are just popping around, and you will see them if you go onto the loch. But we have a load of cliffs around this because it's really close to our main mountain range in the UK, and that's where our largest mountain is, Ben Nevis. Of course, because of this, the mountain goats do live very precariously on the edge, and if they do fall into the loch, unfortunately, there's not really a way for them to get back out. I will say it is a saltwater-based loch, as it is connected to the North Sea at the very top of it, which means that communities of sea life can come in and out of the loch as they see fit. Now, the funniest part of this slide is that all of the pictures on the left are beautiful. They are Google images of Scotland, and they are absolutely stunning. Now, on the right-hand side is from when I went to Loch Ness in March. And you'll see the slight difference in the weather between the two. It's generally, unfortunately, Scotland is usually quite grey and cold. And this is very much how I experienced it. When I was on a lake cruise over Loch Ness back in March, it actually snowed whilst we were going over the loch, but it wasn't snowing anywhere else around the area. It was just on the loch because it was so cold. And it was an open top cruise. And I will say, the open top was not used. But let's talk about the origin of this monster and how it ended up getting so unbelievably famous. Now, I mentioned earlier that it was affectionately named Nessie in the 1940s, but actually Nessie has been around for so much longer than this. The first ever sighting of her was reported all the way back in 565 AD, when an Irish monk buried a man who was reportedly attacked by a sea monster in the loch. Apparently, the monk, who was St. Columba, went in after the creature and made signs of the cross, asking it to leave them alone. And the creature apparently did what it was told. From then on, it's a while until Nessie was spotted again, and this time in the 1870s, there were 2 sightings made, being compared to a large salamander approaching the shore, and another that was swimming very, very fast and looked like an overturned boat. But the first proper serious mentions of Nessie were in the 1930s, when the myth really started to take off. There are 2 really important bits of notes here, and this is one of them is the report from the Inverness Courier from Audie Mackay from 1933, and he famously wrote in the Courier about the beast. I have an extract. The creature disported itself, rolling and plunging for fully a minute, its body resembling that of a whale, and the water cascading and churning like a simmering cauldron. Soon, however, it disappeared in a boiling mass of foam. Both onlookers confessed that there was something uncanny about the whole thing, for they realised that there was no ordinary denizen of the depths here, because apart from its enormous size, the beast, in taking the final plunge sent out waves that were big enough to have been caused by a passing steamer. Her and her husband, who reported it, had been driving past the loch and apparently saw the monster frolicking about in the water, which I think is kind of sweet. Although I can tell you that she was interviewed in the 1980s to kind of follow this up. And she said that the monster rumours had been going around for a really long time before that around Loch Ness. And so it might have impulsed her on her viewing. The other super big sighting in the 1930s was in 1934, and this was the super famous surgeon's photograph. I have got a picture of this later for you, but this is probably the most famous picture of Nessie. You probably know it. If you know anything about Nessie, you're probably picturing it in your head now. But actually, this was taken by a gynecologist back in 1934. And it's been considered the best evidence of Nessie for the last 60 years, which is mad. And it's the image that most people know when you talk about Nessie. I will show you later on, but you'll probably know which one I'm talking about. In the 1950s, the first ever sonar images were performed in Loch Ness, revealing that there was indeed something massive in the loch, and it was written off as a large catfish, but massively swelled public belief in the monster. Now, in the 1960s, the Loch Ness Phenomena Investigation Bureau was put together in the UK, which went out to study Loch Ness and determine the cause of all of the sightings. They were active until 1972 and managed to use movie cameras to trace 80% of the loch surface for investigation. They had over 1,030 members at their peak, which is amazing. And they were from all over the world as well, not just from the UK or Scotland. As well as this, there were a boatload of other sightings and pictures making it to newspapers across the world, hyping up the belief in the monster even more. In 1987, they sent out a deep scanning echolocation team to investigate the loch and found a huge unidentified object of massive size and strength. However, at the time, they believed that it was grey seals that would be occasionally coming into the loch and that it might have got hooked on the bottom of the sea floor. However, really sad news for cryptozoologists everywhere. In 1994, it was revealed that the surgeon's photograph from the 30s was actually a hoax. And he admitted that he'd actually bought a toy submarine at the shop Woolworths. He was, really interestingly, a reporter for the English newspaper The Daily Mail, and he was annoyed that his superiors refused to publish a picture about Nessie tracks around Loch Ness. So he wanted to get revenge, and the best way that he could think of was tricking them and taking a picture of this so-called Nessie. It still is widely believed that it's the only picture of Nessie that stands up to time to this day as well. Now, hopping over to the 2000s, the widespread usage of the internet propelled Nessie into a newfound fame, and supposedly the best footage of Nessie was captured by a fisherman called Gordon Holmes. However, unfortunately, the recording has been lost and it no longer exists, which I think is an absolute tragedy. There were also consistent studies on the loch, commissioned all the way from 1972 to 2008 by Robert H. Rines. He was a really famous American cryptozoologist, and he would fund about 6 sonar studies into the water. He consistently found massive creatures in Loch Ness, but couldn't ever prove what they were due to poor visibility. On his last expedition in 2008, he stated that he believed the monster had gone extinct due to global warming and he was unable to find it ever again, and hung his hat on finding her. The BBC actually commissioned a search for their show, searching for the Loch Ness Monster in 2003, and all they found was a boy. Not a child, but a floating boy, and not much else. It was a real shock for non-believers, and it was very much parded off as a failed investigation. In more recent times, though, there was a DNA sweep done of the loch in 2018, And this found mostly eel and leech DNA, as well as a little bit of seal and otter DNA. They did, though, find some unidentified DNA, which could potentially have been unknown fish species or crustacean DNA of undiscovered animals, as well as potentially Nessie herself. I'll go more into DNA results a bit later. I've got a special slide on that one. Now, Apple Maps accidentally caught Nessie on their satellite imaging of Loch Ness back in 2011. This was met with massive controversy, and Apple really quickly removed the image, and it's now been replaced with just a normal image of Loch Ness. And lastly, in the last 2 years, there have been a load of drone footage released of the supposed monster of Loch Ness, published on YouTube. And my favourite is that there is a permanent live feed of Loch Ness on a YouTube channel called Nessie on the Net. And this has been up for the last few years. It's live right this second. It's going all the time. And I'll show you some of the most recent captures later on. Most excitingly, though, and this is so relevant to today because 3 days ago, we had in the UK the biggest Nessie search in 50 years. And me and Kat definitely didn't prepare this, but it turned out to be a few days before this session. Hundreds of volunteers went out to try and find her, with acoustic, heat tracing, and sonar equipment, as well as monitoring live streams and drones. And I actually have an amazing news clip from this too that I can share with you from NBC. Can one of you let me know if the sound comes through? That would be gorgeous. And typically there is an ad.
I don't hear the sound yet.
Anything?
No, not yet. You might have to stop share and then share audio.
Yeah, okay. I think you're absolutely right. Let's try this. Okay. Are you seeing my screen again?
Yep.
Gorgeous. Yeah. Okay, let's give this a try.
Of curious minds. Yes. But this weekend, the Loch Ness Monster is getting another close-up. And this time, I join the hunt for what's being called the biggest Nessie quest in 50 years. For this region of Scotland, the legend of the Loch Ness Monster is still kind of a big deal. But organizers are hoping that this weekend will excite a new generation of Nessie hunters.
It's about inspiration. For a very selfish reason, I don't want the Loch Ness mystery or the interest in Loch Ness itself to diminish.
It'll be hard for Nessie to hide from this high-tech hunt. They're launching drones overhead, scouring the surface, while also listening below.
So we're dropping a hydrophone, which is an underwater microphone, about 60 feet down below the depth. So we're going to be doing some audio testing to find out what noises exist down there.
This is our history behind us.
And they're using sonar to map the lake, which has a depth of nearly 800 feet.
That's maximum depth here. This is the deepest part, but it's a huge area.
Somewhere in all this dark water, there's a monster lurking, and it's up to us to find it. Or find her.
The first time they launched it...
Ken Gerhardt traveled from the U.S. for the hunt. He researches animals that live on the fringes of our known reality. But you've studied Bigfoot, Chupacabra, Mothman, all of these other fantastical ideas. Where does Nessie rank in terms of likelihood?
Personally, I'm 90% convinced that Nessie exists. I've never had a sighting or an observation, but if you immerse yourself in the evidence, you have over 1,000 good sightings that are very consistent descriptions.
Spoiler alert, nobody found the monster this weekend, not even me. And not for lack of trying, but maybe that's not what this is all about.
It's just a fun myth.
Yeah, if it's not real.
But are you a believer or not a believer?
I'm a believer.
In a world of high tech and hard facts, it's nice to know there's still a place for magic and mystery.
Someone's always going to say there's going to be something that makes you believe, that wants you to believe. And again, it's the same with every myth out there. It just takes one person to believe in it, and it just continues.
Matt Bradley, NBC News, Loch Ness, Scotland.
I thought that was such a good summary of what happened, and what an amazing opportunity 3 days before this presentation for this to happen. And of course, it is August here in the UK, and you could see everyone wearing their raincoats in Scotland, which summarises what I said earlier. It's really cold. And you might have spotted it in that last clip, but this is the surgeon's photograph that I was talking about. So this is the hoax that was uncovered back in 1994 and taken in 1934. And everyone did believe that this was the only photo of Nessie in existence for all that time. It was a toy submarine. And don't get me wrong, I can't quite see it myself. I do like the idea, though, of a grown man putting a toy submarine in a giant lake and taking a picture of it. The scale here, though, is really what's missing here. And of course, the technology back in 1934 with cameras perhaps wasn't the best. And so I think if this had been zoomed out and we'd have seen the scale of the Loch in comparison, we probably would have seen that it was a very small toy submarine. But it's especially convincing. I still think you could totally get away with this being Nessie. I actually always thought that this picture was a log, where you can kind of see this trunk kind of shape here with this arm bit of potentially a branch. I always thought it was that, but finding it was a toy submarine, I was like, oh, well, I guess it's that. But what could Nessie actually be, though? Well, there have been some other monsters that she has been linked to within Scottish and worldwide folklore. So firstly, and the most common, is that she is a plesiosaur. This very real-life monster, I will make this clear, did roam the seas during the Triassic period, which was over 203 million years ago. These beasts had really long necks, snake-like heads, and flippers, and are generally what most people think Nessie looks like. However, these very real dinosaurs only lived in fresh water, and they died out 66 million years ago in the Cretaceous period, but they did manage to live all over the world's oceans. Maybe they could have been got in through the loch by the sea by accident and involved. This could be a potential explanation, but it's the most common thought that Loch Ness. But this is the most common thought when it comes to Loch Ness, and this is this lone Jurassic beast that lives in the depths of Loch Ness as well. Another favourite and potential candidate for Nessie existence is the Kelpie. And as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, this is my favourite mythic beast of all time. It's another Scottish monster, and it's a favourite in the UK, as it's been included in loads of our local folklore and even in massive films like Harry Potter. These are very literal seahorses, and they were malevolent creatures who would tempt children and travellers to pet them whilst in marsh or swampland. And once they were touched, their hair would turn to a tar-like substance, so you wouldn't be able to pull your hand away from it. And it would run into the water, take you all the way to the bottom, drown, and then eat you. Because of this monster, and it's the fact that it is a water beast and Scottish, deriving from Celtic cautionary tales, it could make sense that this monster could come from this one. And due to the elusive nature of both, it could be possible. Lastly, though, and the most vague out of all of these, is the sea serpent. I'd love to tell you exactly what anyone means by sea serpent, but it could be a variety of things and a variety of monsters. Sea serpent myths are included in almost all worldwide mythologies, including within holy books. For example, the Leviathan from the Bible was considered a sea serpent, Jormungand from Norse mythology, as well as the legendary Kraken, are both noted as sea serpents. However, all of them also have other descriptions, such as the Kraken being a giant, mighty squid, for example. Because of the humps, though, on Nessie's back, sometimes she is considered, alongside the dinosaur-like features of her body and head. She has been linked to sea serpents before. We just don't really know how to explain them, other than scary big long fish with snake heads. But what could she be realistically? If we take out the mythical bit, what can we be mistaking her for? Well, We know through DNA searches and all of the sonar and fishing that they've done in Loch Ness that these creatures are all in and out of Loch Ness through the sea. However, you may be thinking, Erin, how does a leech, a lamprey, or an eel even come into consideration with this massive monster? Well, unfortunately, that's where the biggest cryptid dream crusher comes in, and that is misidentification. It is believed that most Nessie sightings are most likely one of these three culprits, and that they have either been seen swimming very close to the surface or even coming up for air. They do have the same kind of body shape as Nessie, and they can swim very, very fast as they are natural sea creatures, and they disappear very much into the black depths of the loch itself. There's also the idea of the Wells catfish, which I didn't put a picture of in here, but they go up to massive sizes. They grow up to 10 foot, and I would say imagine that for your dinner. It will keep you going for a good few weeks. Now, the idea that the leech idea actually comes from the same belief as the eels, although there aren't nearly as many leeches or lampreys in Loch Ness. In fact, leeches tend to favour very shallow water, such as rivers, rather than lakes, and especially ones as big as Loch Ness. They also tend to stick to warmer climates, and honestly, we do have a lot of leech species here in the UK, but they are much further south than the Highlands because of the weather. Or we have some of the actual mammalian culprits, grey seals or otters, who very occasionally swim into the loch or around the north coast of Scotland. These are probably a little bit more plausible just due to their size and their nature. Seals and otters tend to avoid people up close, and they could potentially look like those larger humps under the waves, especially from further away or in darker evenings. Now, one on here that I've not mentioned and is my absolute favourite is the Greenland shark. Now, these sharks are amazing and they've not got enough press. They are so cool. But these sharks can live up to over 100 years old, and they are usually cold, deep water sharks. Now, these have been found around the coast of Scotland before, but tend to live around Scandinavia, hence the name, the Greenland shark, and they tend to chill out around the Arctic, very literally. These are, though, unfortunately, some of the most unfortunate creatures in the sea, and although they live for a really long time, every single one of these sharks are born with parasites in their eyeballs. And eventually, the parasite grows out of their eyes and makes them completely blind. So every single picture you'll see of them, you'll either notice the worm hanging out or them completely blind. And actually, this picture here that I've got of one, you can kind of see this parasite just on here. And then you've got the cloudy eye rather than a traditional jet black shark eye. These sharks, though, can grow up to 25 foot long, and they've never attacked people. There's not a single record of them doing so because they are so rarely seen due to their deep water nature. But I could totally see the rarity as well being misidentified as Nessie. Now, let's talk a little bit of science. We have touched on it a little bit, but let's go a little bit deeper. So, with sonar, this allows us to see the seafloor with sonar technology, showing high concentrations through almost heat-like signatures. So as much as this does look like a heat map, it's all sonar, this one. Now, this scan is the centre of Loch Ness, and the red line here at the bottom is the seafloor. And this deep-dwelling figure in this circle is what we believe to be this misidentified or unidentified large beast. This could be Nessie, but if we're talking scale, this is a really large reading. And you see these like these little dark blue ones at the top, and you've got these little ones at the top here. These are all shoals of fish. So you can see the size difference is massive in comparison to hundreds and hundreds of fish up here. We've got this one really big living thing underneath. We still don't know what this was. This sonar was taken, I believe, back in the 2000s. And we just don't know what this is. But if you go over Loch Ness with a sonar now, you will generally see these lovely little shoals of fish up the top. And I will say, when I went on one, we didn't even have any fish, which was a little bit sad, but it was very cold. When talking about the DNA found, though, the more specifics of that is that, as I said, it was mostly eel and leech DNA, with that coming in at about 67% of it found. They also found some otter and seal DNA, as well as some dolphin and some orca DNA too, which makes sense due to our location. We do get killer whales occasionally, as well as dolphins off the North Scottish coast, as we are very close to Norway and the fjords. But 11% of this DNA is completely unknown to us. And it could be that there is an undiscovered species, such as plankton, which might account for the large amount, or even fish or plants. But it could also be our dinosaur that we're looking for. But we've still not figured this out yet either. Now, talking about cultural impact, and this is probably my favourite part of Nessie. When talking about Nessie in a wider cultural view, she has been fully embraced by Scottish culture. If you go to any gift shop in Edinburgh, which is the Scottish capital and is very south in comparison to Inverness, you will find thousands of Nessie gift shops, as well as thistles, haggis, tartan, kilts, and of course, my favourite, Scotch whisky. But Nessie really put Scotland on the map for a lot of people outside of the UK. And this is going all the way back to the 1900s, or early 1900s, should I say. Whilst down here in England, we do have a very interesting relationship with the Scots. Local tourism, even from the countries within the UK, is really spectacular in the Highlands. We do go up a massive amount because it is quite easy to cross the border. And not only is it a place of immense beauty, the Highlands, it's just gorgeous. I really recommend if you can get out, it's beautiful. There's a place called Glencoe, which is the most gorgeous place you'll ever see in your life. It's just gorgeous caves and cliffs. It's lovely. But you've not only got that and Highland cows, of course, but you've got the monster herself. Scotland, though, is traditionally quite a poor country. If you've ever seen the movie Trainspotting from the 90s, it's probably the closest depiction of some of these rougher areas within Scotland, and actually one of those more rural places within Scotland, and even really in the UK. Inverness is very much in the Highlands, though, so is very rural, and most of the local people work on farms, or they commute into the bigger cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh. Meaning very traditional locals are usually working manual jobs for not very much pay. And because of this, Scotland's cost of living is very much lower than the rest of the UK, and a lot of American, English, and Middle Eastern families have second homes here in the Highlands. So bringing in a massive cultural figure like Nessie brings in so much needed tourism to these areas, and they have massively thrived because of it. Now, here are some stats around actual tourism as well. There are 2 museums dedicated to the Loch Ness Monster in Inverness, one of which being the Loch Ness Exhibition Centre, which is this lovely picture here. Now, they have an amazing array of local history around the monster, around the loch, as well as an incredible gift shop, I will say, and being the hub for any scientific or research projects going on in the area looking for the monster. So this one done a few days ago was completely run out of the exhibition centre here. There is also a Nessie theme park, which has a load of Nessie themed rides. It is affectionately called Nessie Land. I can't say I've been, but it is really made for younger children, and I don't think I could get away with it. And most importantly, and what I really love to do whenever I get up to Loch Ness, is the cruises. And they go up and down the loch, and it's such a massive body of water that one cruise will start at the very bottom of the loch, and just an hour away will only go not very far into it. So if you think of the loch as this big, it's maybe this amount of the loch you can do in an hour. It is a huge body of water. This is a really good experience, though. It's got sonar equipment on board usually, and a really good host speaker who will come on and talk about the local legend. They'll talk about the monster and the history of the loch itself. I will say on the right-hand side is a picture of me on the loch on the cruise, and they had some really sweet little stickers. So you can see I've got this little Nessie behind me, and it's so that you can take a picture with the monster even if you don't manage to see it. It's a huge hit with American tourists, and when I was actually there were two schools of American children, all from Utah, and it definitely felt very strange as a Brit to be a smaller amount of Brits than Brits in Britain. It was very odd, but amazing to see how interested American children were in something that seems so small but has become this massive worldwide phenomenon. Before the pandemic hit, though, Loch Ness brought in over 313,000 tourists from all over the world who spent on average over £89 million or $112 million in today's exchange rate, which is a huge amount of money for a really rural area. And every penny really does go back to the local community and to these amazing exhibits and museums. And it does make me incredibly proud to be a Brit. Not only that, though, she brings in a physical and monetary benefit, of course, but for myth monster enthusiasts like myself, the Loch Ness Monster brought about loads of other monsters worldwide. Now, the Mekele Membe in the African Congo River is immensely similar to the Loch Ness Monster, with the same general features and living in the swampy mangroves of the Congo, with, unfortunately, a people-eating habit, which does make him quite different to our lovely, very timid Nessie. The Mekele Membe, or in English, it's one who stops the flow of rivers, has been around since 1911 in Cameroon, but is very often noted to have been inspired by the Loch Ness Monster rumours by German adventurers who discovered her. Another that you may know over in the States, and I hope some of you do, is Champ or Champy, who is the lake monster from the River Champlain, which runs all the way from Quebec in Canada through Pittsburgh, New York, and Burlington, Vermont. He has been spotted over 300 times since 1609 and is again noted to be a 20-foot serpent-like creature. And this picture is probably the most famous one of Champ that has been taken. It was taken back in the 80s. But Champ is usually named the Nessie of the US, and Lake Champlain and the surrounding areas do have increased tourism because of this monster. And he's even the mascot of the Vermont Lake Monsters baseball team. Lastly, though, going to a little bit northern and going into Canada, there is the Ogopogo, another famous lake monster from Northern America. This monster inhabits Lake Okanagan in British Columbia. I couldn't read that for a second. This one is mostly described as a sea serpent and is absolutely massive in comparison to these other ones. It's around 50 foot in length, and the only picture I have of it is this lovely statue that stands near it. There are no official photos of him, but it's been around since 1872 and is noted to move a lot faster than Nessie. However, many do believe that this is actually from a native myth monster descended from Nataka, which is an evil supernatural being, and it translates into water demon or water god. But due to the native nature of this monster, there aren't really any documented dates as to when this came about, as most of them were spread through word of mouth in tribes. But we can definitely see the Nessie resemblance here, and it is curious to think if the natives were potentially inspired by rumours going about with the British coming in. Now, if you're into modern media, I have got a whole bunch of suggestions on what to watch or read so you can get even more interested in the Loch Ness Monster and anything within the Loch Ness depths. So for movies, I've listed a few here. My favourites in this one are the top three. You've got the lovely Waterhorse film, which also has a book. You've just got the movie called Loch Ness. You've got the Loch Ness Horror, which is a horror movie version of the Loch Ness Monster. The Librarian, Incident at Loch Ness. They feature in Monsters, Inc. and Beyond Loch Ness as well as a documentary. In TV, though, of course, I've got this wonderful moving image from The Simpsons when Nessie featured. It's actually not her first mention in The Simpsons, but this is the one I could find. But another real great suggestion is Primeval, Conspiracy Missing Evidence, South Park. And over here, back in the UK, we have a cartoon called The Family Ness, which is all about the Loch Ness Monster family. And of course, if you're into more of your cryptid and monster of the week shows, there's the X-Files and the Lost Tapes as well. Also, if you're interested in dinosaurs, I would really recommend Primeval. It's a BBC show from the noughties, and it's about if dinosaurs were a common occurrence and they just ran around. It was very, very good. For books, though, I have two different categories with this one. So if you want to look into Nessie as more of an icon or a cultural impacting monster, as adults, of course we all are, I would really recommend Nessie, the Surgeon's Photograph Exposed by David Martin. This one is all about the hoax of the surgeon's photograph, how it was taken, how it came about, and all about the drama that went down about the hoax. You've also got The Monsters of Loch Ness, The History and the Mystery by Malcolm Robinson. And this is a really good book if you want to learn more about what else is in Loch Ness and all of the theories as to what the Loch Ness Monster could be. Of course, if you do have some grandchildren or some younger relatives and friends, I would really recommend these two books. So there's The Treasure of the Loch Ness Monster by Larry Donn, which is a beautifully illustrated children's book. It's all over Scotland when you go into any gift shops. It's the most beautiful illustrated book, all about the legend and the story around it. And you've also, for the older children, you've got The Loch Ness Monster Behind the Legend by Erin Peabody. And this one is more of a case file into Loch Ness, so probably more for your teenagers or your 10 to 15-year-olds. Lastly, though, I want to talk about Nessie on the Net, which is this little screenshot up here. I did talk about it earlier. It's the live YouTube channel of Loch Ness, which I mentioned earlier. This is a live stream and it's permanently running of the Loch Ness for any avid Nessie hunters. If you're far away, if you're on the other side of the pond like you are, you'll be able to keep an eye on Loch Ness and see what's going on. And I've actually managed to pull a video from this week into the presentation from a few days ago. So it does, I will warn you, it's a lovely live stream if you just want to look at the Scottish countryside. So let's see if it, of course there is an advert.
Struggling with any kind of progressive hearing loss or persistent.
There we go. And this is from the 28th, so it was 3 days ago, and this is 6 o'clock in the morning. So you can see it's absolutely gorgeous. And if you do just want to have this on in the background, I very often do, not even to look for Loch Ness, but to just look over the Scottish countryside. It's absolutely beautiful. And I'll just skip along a little bit so we can kind of see the progression. And this is just the sun coming up over the loch. It's just beautiful. And I believe some sheep join us in a second. There we go. And that's it. You can tune on to this anytime on YouTube. It is always going. So if you do fancy keeping an eye out for Nessie or just looking at these gorgeous sheep in their outside pen near the loch, you can have a look at that. I'm sure your team will point you in the right direction. But we are coming to the end of the session, which I'm very sad about. But I imagine you are all thinking, Erin, do you believe in the Loch Ness Monster? Now, in short, it's maybe. But I really want this one to be true, in all honesty. I really do. I think it's so important for us in the UK to love a monster as much as Nessie. And whilst we do have some amazing folklore and mythology within the UK, within Celtic and Irish mythology, as well as just core British mythology, especially with Fae, Nessie is really our beloved cryptid of the UK. It also really brings us together with Scotland, which is pretty difficult to do. I will tell you that from an English woman. It also generates an amazing tourist revenue for the area, and it keeps it clean, keeps it conserved, just for future generations to appreciate this beautiful loch, but also a fantastic monster. It funds a loads of tourist and local activities as well, and really encourages the Scottish public to embrace their heritage with this monster. Now, would I swim in it? Absolutely not. I'm not crazy. It's freezing. And the idea of eels swimming around my ankles is an absolute no-go for me. But again, it's the idea that because of this crushing pressure at the bottom, because it is so deep, it's too much for our cameras to look into. And we just don't know what's lurking in the bottom there. There could be a kraken there for all we know. And I'll be honest, I'd rather not know. Following that DNA study as well, though, we don't know what Nessie is. So maybe her DNA has just never come up. I really do hope she is in there. I am a true believer. I want her to be there. But I do think it's a really lovely and inoffensive folklore tale. However, on a more realistic side, I do probably think it's a case of misidentification, which is really sad. But I think most likely the suspects are either a big eel or a shark of some kind. So I guess we'll just have to keep looking and make sure that we keep an eye out for her. I can certainly say from being there, it's a huge body of water. So there could be anything living in it. And as well as we've only discovered 5% of the world's oceans. So we really don't know what's going in there. And there could be a Nessie everywhere for all we know. But I want to thank you all so much for letting me join you from across the pond this afternoon. It's been an absolute pleasure, but I would love to open the floor to all of you for any questions about Loch Ness or the monster or anything else we've covered here today. Your lovely facilities team, Kat, have popped through a few questions if there's none, but we can go over those too, but I'll fully open the floor. Over to you.
I'm going to ask one. Erin, where can we find your podcast?
Oh, well, I've got a whole separate slide for that next, Kat. Don't you worry.
Perfect.
I'll go over that in a second. Thank you, though.
I have a question.
Go on.
So do people believe that there is, you may have already talked about this and I missed it, but do people believe that there's just one, or do people hypothesize that it's got a family or like a pod of them, or what's going on in there? Is it a bachelor or is it a
Well, we always assume that Nessie is female due to the affectionate name we've all given her. However, of course, we've never found Nessie, so we just don't know. It might be a lone bachelor. But we do assume that, unfortunately, it's not a family Ness. It is just the singular Ness monster, which does make me a little bit sad. But we've never found any record of reproduction or anything along those lines to support that there might be more than one. And of course, because it's so rarely kind of spotted and there's been no actual like full-blown evidence of it existing bar photos and videos, it has been considered that there is just the one lone monster out there.
Yeah, that is a little sad.
Isn't it? I think so too. I'd happily go and join it if it wasn't so cold.
Erin, I have a question for you.
Absolutely.
I was curious. So when did this start for you to follow Nessie, and what was, I guess when did this start, and how did it inspire you to what you do today?
Yeah. Oh gosh, what a lovely question. As I said at the very beginning, mythology for me has always been a real interest. I'm a real history nerd. I grew up reading Greek myths. I've always been really inspired by the Greeks and all of the mythology surrounding, especially European mythology. I think it's so intrinsically interesting and it's so different to what we have in culture now. But with the Loch Ness, it is... She has a bit of my heart because, of course, she's my local cryptid in the sense of I'm very, very proud to put if I put any British monster next to me in anything, I mean, you can see it in my little animation here. I've got the only British monster I have is Nessie here. And it's just a beautiful cultural embrace, I think, especially from the Scottish perspective and how much they've embraced it. And for me, as someone who loves history and I love folklore and the history of where I'm from, and I'm sure all of you feel it too, it's really deeply ingrained. I'm really proud of my history and my folklore. And Loch Ness is so close to me, and especially, I mean, you've probably noticed I've got red hair. I have got Scottish ancestry. My granddad is Scottish, and it's for me, it's that home sense of just adoring something that is so embraced by everyone there and everyone here, really. And the fact that everyone else outside of the UK loves it too is amazing to me.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. Fabulous. Any other questions at all, folks? I think I've got one from, where is it?
Someone mentioned maybe a throwback from the Seal family millions of years ago.
Maybe so. That's it. We just don't know. That's the most fascinating thing about Loch Ness, and actually was going to move me on to that question as well that I found in your notes, Kat. Why are people so fascinated with Loch Ness and cryptids and mythical monsters, not just from my perspective, but in the whole worldly perspective? I think it's generally we are curious as to the unknown. I think we naturally want to discover things as humans and figure out where the roots of things have come from. And especially with something like cryptids, who have questionable backgrounds in terms of they could have been spotted 10 years ago, or maybe something like in the 60s. Like Mothman is a great example of this. It's a much newer cryptid, for example. It started in 64 and is now culturally embraced in West Virginia, and there's a festival, and he's known to be one of a fan favorite for cryptozoologists. And that kind of thing for me is super interesting. But I think for generally the human race, we are inquisitive and we are curious, and we want to know stuff around us and figure out what motivates things. And with cryptids and mythology, it's that background knowledge that we have to all of our culture, but reflected almost into something new and mysterious that we can't figure out. Gorgeous. Okie dokie. Any last questions at all, folks? Fabulous. Okie dokie. And onto your one from earlier, Kat. Fantastic. Thank you so much for all of your questions. They were all so brilliant. Thank you. That is all from me today, but I hope you enjoyed. And of course, I do run the podcast. If you're interested in hearing more about monsters or more about my journey into podcasting and folklorism, I release a new episode on a new monster every Thursday afternoon here in the UK. And I actually did Davy Jones last week, which was a really interesting one, and I learned loads. And of course, we will naturally go to the Bill Nye one from Pirates of the Caribbean, and it's completely different, and things like that are so exciting to me. But it's available on all streaming services. I'm sure the folks on your facilities teams will pop you forward any links. They're on all of the basic ones, but you can also get in touch with me via my website or via my email on screen. Again, if you want to, I'm sure your team will happily pass these on. And again, thank you so much for listening and participating. It's been such a pleasure, and I really enjoyed our trip to Bonnie, Scotland, and I hope you did too for the Loch Ness Monster. But another massive thank you for Kat and everyone on the team for inviting me along. It's been such an honour to speak to all of you today, from so far away, and it's just been a pleasure and a fantastic opportunity to speak with you all this afternoon. But I hope you have an amazing rest of your summer and that your next legend that you chase is as wonderful as you've all been. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin. We appreciate you.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was wonderful.